OKCCAC Center for Christianity and African Culture, located at Abia State University, Uturu, in Abia State in Nigeria. You are very welcome. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the center and the things we are doing there, and also about the vision and mission. Now, the center is set up to continue with the vision and mission of Professor Obu Okekalo, mentored very many people, and he was interested in pulling up the academic and strengthening the academic generations in Africa, especially, or those working on Africa, topics on Africa and Africa diaspora, and cause them to be engaged in their communities, get primary data in historiography and all that, so that they can tell the African story themselves and tell it themselves. And the fact that we are living in a time where we are sitting on data and do not realize we are. So to encourage this generation after generation to be strong in their academic endeavors and do it with very little funding, you can do so much. So that's the vision of it. And so he had a vast collection of material, some old books and manuscripts, things you will not find anywhere else. And so there is a library set up on that. He's also interested in collection of information papers of important people who have engaged in the community and in the Christianity story in Africa, so that we will not lose those materials when people usually pass on. So we also collect these materials, and we will welcome all sorts of many of these materials. Now we have a strange demand for a whole lot of material in the to be deposited, and if you are interested, please help bring them in. And that is whatever has been written by pastors, major pastors, and things like that in your area, in any part of Africa and African diaspora. Let us have a collection of it, one place where it could be accessed by other people in years to come, if not right now. So please join us in doing so. And so we have both the library, and the purpose of the webinars is to train people. We hold conferences too, every 2 years or so. The next one will come next year. But the webinars, we tend to have it monthly, hopefully, and so that we can continue to take your concerns about areas you need access, or you need to be strengthened in academics, or questions you need to ask. And we can help direct your thoughts towards that area. So after this brief introduction, and I'm sure others can add more to it. Let me thank you for coming. You would have a marvelous time today. I'm going to introduce to you Professor Korieh of Marquette University, Wisconsin, USA, who is a major historian for the African diaspora. And Korieh has done marvelous research work everywhere in, on the continent of Africa, covering the slave trade communities, and especially the Igbo communities. He's a speaker at so many events and conferences, and he runs conferences, he runs training, international workshops, including some for cadastral. You know, he is so strong in as a social scientist and as a historian in telling the African story and gathering indigenous African community information, especially the Igbo community one. He also edited one of his books he edited. Please look out for his books. They are strong books in African history. He also edited a book, Religion, History, and Politics in Nigeria in honor of Professor Ogbu Okekalo while he was still alive in 2005. Without further ado, may I welcome Professor Chima Korieh. He will tell you more about himself. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me. I recall I was at Abia State University when the center opened, and I'm very glad to still be associated with the center and its activities. Professor Okekalo was a mentor to me, and somebody I hold in very high esteem, and that reverence for him, in many ways, extends to the family as a whole, including Madam, and I cherish the times and periods that I used to visit when he was at the University of Toronto on sabbatical. I recall maybe every 2 weeks or so I go cut his hair, and it's swallow and food, African food, which was rare for me as a student. So I'm very glad to be associated with the center. I understand that I will speak for about 20 minutes, and then maybe we can have questions. And I'm supposed to speak to the issue of research methodology and grant writing. I'm going to try to share my screen, hopefully, so that everyone can have an opportunity to see what I want to talk about. Okay, so let me find how to share this. Okay, so I can't share my screen, so it's disabled. I don't know
sorry,
if
just
you
give me
could.
a minute. Just give me a minute.
Okay.
Let me hold on. Okay, please try again.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so I'm going to be very brief because I have 20 minutes, and I know other people are going to be speaking, so I'll try to keep to time. I think the issues of research methodology, I'll begin from there, is very critical and important when we consider that most of the work we do as scholars, as well as centers such as the Okekalo Center, try to address the most fundamental question that scholars have addressed over time. That is, how do we know what we know? How do we study what we study? How do we gather information in order to analyze and draw conclusions about events and issues that we study? So research methodology seems to me a very critical and important aspect of what scholars do. And in many respects, research methodology are important procedures for collecting and analyzing data. And the sort of data that you collect or the research method that you integrate into your research is very critical in how you overall design your research. So when scholars attempt to study a phenomena or event, they are interested in a couple of things. First is, how will you collect data? And data, one may look at it as sort of the ingredients from which you draw conclusions and analysis, and from which you can produce knowledge. So how do you collect data? Your method also depends on what kind of data you want to collect, and how that is going to be possible to answer your questions. And of course, most of us who have some training or have applied, research methodology, are always confronted by two fundamental, areas of data collection. One is, are we collecting qualitative data or quantitative data? And will your data that you collect, take the form of words, experiences of people, or are we dealing with numbers? So I think those sort of are important particularly for, when I mentor graduate students or undergraduate students, to think about, what this means for the overall project that you wish to. Is it qualitative or quantitative? And also, are we collecting primary or secondary data? Most undergraduates or graduate students would attempt to go to the field in most cases, particularly in the social sciences and humanities, collect primary data. And these are sort of original data that they're going to be able to generate themselves, from interviews, from survey, and so on and so forth. So the other one is, of course, is it experimental, where you measure something or perform experiments. The second aspect of it is sort of think about how you analyze your data. If you have quantitative data, what kind of material or what kind of method are you going to use to analyze your data? You use statistical method to test relationship between variables. Or if you have quantitative data for those people who, particularly humanities, who do, social history and so on and so forth, this method is kind of maybe important in terms of how you analyze patterns and meanings attached to basic phenomena in your research. Okay. So, but most scholars, or most of what we do in terms of research methodology, draws from these sort of fundamental issues and questions that have been part of knowledge production in Africa, in terms of methodology and in terms of the pros and cons of those methodology. For example, there's a lot of reliance on qualitative methodology for people, like in history or religion, people who study culture and ways of life, because they are flexible. They can often adjust you can often adjust your method as you engage in the research and as you develop new knowledge. It can also, be conducted, with small sample. But in many instances, that is not going to help you to analyze issues statistically, or to generalize or generalize your result for a broader population. Quantitative data can help you to do that. You can use that to systematically describe large collection of data. Say you're looking at population census, you're looking at the impact of particular phenomenon on population. You can use population data and to do that. You can also generate reproducible knowledge, but this also requires some level of training, statistical training to analyze data, and also requires large samples, which for most of the stuff that your students are going to be doing, we may not be able to have that skill and competency. There's also, I think, important ways in which these two methods can be combined. What scholars would call mixed method research, where you use both quantitative as well as qualitative research methods. There's also some there's also some level of understanding that primary data or secondary data is important depending on the kind of research you want to produce. So primary data, of course, is important. It's original data that you collect yourself for the purposes of answering basic research or your research question. And this could be through surveys or observations or experiments, while secondary data relies on data or materials collected by other researchers, such as census figures, like I talked about earlier. So, but I am a little bit more interested in sort of an African-centered epistemology on knowledge production. I think this is maybe one area we need to start thinking and talking about more systematically than just research methodology in general, because most of what we know in terms of methodology is come from sort of Western epistemological traditions. And to a very large extent, today, people are thinking about how these fit into our understanding of African society and African, phenomena and African conditions. So the context, I think, is important. And a much more sophisticated way of looking at methodology is to see how they fit into our inquiry about African societies. I'm interested in terms of, understanding if there's an African indigenous method of inquiry. When you study a particular society, do you understand that society from drawing from the indigenous ways of looking at events and issues in that society? And I think there are several methods and techniques that we adopt today in Africa, that we could adopt in Africa, that existed before the modern sort of European knowledge production and European science developed in the continent. So, for example, why do we rely on interviews when we want to understand an event? We interview one person about a phenomenon when, often community is more critical and important in terms of how people order their lives. How do we apply often the idea of interviews, focus groups, surveys that are drawn from a different epistemological tradition? I think this is sort of important because most of what we know about Africa and our reliance on the knowledge production in Africa comes from the Western tradition. And we choose methods that often misinterpret the conditions and context of Africa and African societies. So it's important, I think, for us to begin to think about, what method is appropriate for the population that we want to study. Regarding considering the fact that most of us who study Africa, come from the Western traditions, come from Western institutions. Our funding comes from Western, institutions or granting agencies. They are interested in particular kinds of questions. And so for the African researcher or an African who is interested in epistemology